So, Asha, is the rule of law finally dead?
Eh, it's complicated. I'm Asha Rangappa. I teach national security law at Yale University. I'm a former FBI special agent, and I'm a legal and national security analyst.
And I'm Renato Mariotti. I'm a former federal prosecutor, a practicing lawyer, and a legal analyst.
And we're here to help you understand topics that can't be boiled down into a soundbite or a scheme.
Wow, Asha, what a week.
Uh, yeah. I recorded a podcast earlier this week, Ezra Klein's podcast, which has a lot of people listen to that. So, and the title of that podcast is "The Emergency Is Here."
Agree
And
with that?
yes, and he kept asking me, "Well, what's the next step? Like, what do we do?" And I was like, there's only so many chess moves, and then
Yeah.
you finally get to checkmate or whatever, like the final the final move. And so we're pretty much there, I think. And the Kilmar Abrego Garcia case seems to have really pushed the envelope all the way very quickly.
Ve- Very interesting. Yeah, I agree with you 100%. 100%. This is a case, there's been, I would say, a couple major developments. I'm going to think three major developments this week. The the Trump administration claims that they cannot get Mr. Abrego Garcia back from El Salvador. This is the individual who the Trump administration admittedly made a mistake in deporting. They didn't have justification for doing so. And then they said, well, we can't get him back, Judge, because it's in the hands of El Salvador. We don't have any control over the situation. It's totally not something we can do. It's worth noting the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals sees through this and a decision which we'll talk about. We could talk about that. By the way, the White House's response to that is essentially to admit that they have some control over this situation because they actually publicly come out and say there's actually kind of very problematic post on the X platform in which the White House is like, he's never coming back, essentially suggesting that they have some control over this. And for a period of time throughout the week, Senator Van Hollen, a Democrat from Maryland, goes down to El Salvador to try to meet with Mr. Abrego Garcia. And the El Salvador government's like, no, we're letting Republicans in, but not you. And eventually he does get a meeting. But it really looks like the Trump administration is able to make people disappear, go to El Salvador. And despite all the orders of the courts, and there was yet another one, a class just today, Asha, we're recording this on Friday, April 18th, a judge issued an injunction on behalf of a whole class of people saying, do not deport these people overseas. You cannot do it. Despite any of that, the Trump administration seems to believe that they could do what they want here. And the courts, despite a unanimous decision by the United States Supreme Court, can't really force them to do anything else.
Yeah, I think we need to really unpack this from the beginning. And there's different cases going on, but I think the Abrego Garcia case sort of encapsulates all of the legal issues very well in kind of his singular story, which I think is why people are getting it. But I think it's worth kind of going through a little bit of the chronology of that particular case and how that's unfolded. And I want to kind of go back a ways because I think there's also a lot of misinformation out there about, his past and things like that. And I think it's important to kind of just understand the timeline of what's going on. And I have this diagram in front of me that somebody, a lawyer on Blue Sky, had posted, which is really helpful. So Abrego Garcia fled El Salvador when he was 16. A gang, not MS-13, I think it's called Barrio 18, was trying to extort him. So he flees El Salvador. He comes to the United States in 2011, and he moves in with his brother, and who's a U.S. citizen, and he lives there. Then in 2019, he gets arrested for loitering outside of Home Depot. And a police officer basically accuses him of being a gang member. So the Trump administration has been waving around this document accusing Abrego Garcia of being a gang member. Basically, the accusation is based on the fact that he was wearing Chicago Bulls gear, and that a confidential informant claimed that he was a ranking member of the MS-13 gang, of some part of it that operates in Long Island, even though he has never lived there.
I will just note that I often wear Chicago Bulls gear as a Chicago Bulls fan.
Well, if I were you, I would not loiter at Home Depot, and yeah, and I would carry I guess ID with you or something, though I don't know that makes a difference anymore. So at his bond hearing, the immigration judge denies Kilmar Garcia bond, finding that the police accusation, the evidence that they presented, was sufficient proof of gang membership, even though it had a lot of flaws. And then Abrego Garcia appeals that decision to the Board of Immigration Appeals. And then this is where the judge says that although he's ineligible for asylum because he filed his application too late, this judge grants Abrego Garcia a withholding of removal, finding that it was more likely than not that he would be subject to persecution if deported to El Salvador. So he actually is under a removal order, but with a restriction that the one country he can't go to is El Salvador. So that's sort of where his situation stood. The final adjudication on his case, after this evidence had been reviewed and appealed, was that he could not be deported to El Salvador. Of course, on brand for the Trump administration, he gets rounded up on a plane and sent to El Salvador.
And not just to like sit on the beach in El Salvador, but in a very notorious maximum security prison that was constructed to hold gang members and terrorists and so forth.
So, Renato, I do think it's worth pausing here because I think that point is really important, right? We are talking about summary deportations where people are being rounded up and flown to Mexico or El Salvador, as you just said, and just like let off on the beach, which also is very disruptive and not great. But if it's okay, see you later, good luck, and figure out what you're going to do, at least you're free.
Right. Big
right?
difference.
Big difference.
Big difference.
To basically send them, to remove them from this country, but then imprison them, I think implicates a whole other set of issues, by the way, the separation of powers issues, in my opinion, that we can talk about. So anyway, he's sent to El Salvador. He's put in CCOT prison. So his lawyers file a petition for a writ of habeas corpus. The lower court basically says, you need to bring him back because he is entitled to due process before you remove him. And he was under a removal order. And this is the case where the Department of Justice concedes that he was sent in error.
That's right. And it's important. I think we've talked about this case on prior episodes. And I think the language of what the district court said that the executive branch had to do is important here, and ultimately becomes important later in the story.
Yes. Department of Justice concedes that he sent an error. The judge says you have to do everything in your power to bring him back because he, by the way, the kind of the last thing that the order that he's under was a withholding of removal. In other words, he was not allowed to be removed. So do everything in your power to facilitate and effectuate his return. And the Trump administration appeals this. It goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court upholds the lower court order 9-0, but says, we don't think that the court can order the Trump administration to effectuate this return, but the court can tell the government to facilitate the return with due deference for the president's kind of core authority in foreign affairs.
And
so
that's
this is the piece that Stephen Miller was trumpeting as, a slam dunk win for the Trump administration.
Right, a quote unquote win. And what we spent a lot of time discussing in our last episode. And that's why the events of this week, I think it's just helpful background. The events of this week are so important, right? Because they really crystallize that issue.
So then it comes back down, and basically the Trump administration wants to go back into the district court and litigate what the meaning of facilitate is. And the judge is just not having it. She's like, I think we understand what facilitate means. It means do what, take appropriate steps to bring him back. And so there was this whole wrangling about that. And then she basically ordered the Trump administration to provide reports to her on an ongoing basis to provide the court with the status and location of Abrego Garcia, what steps they're taking, and what steps they plan to take. And the government filed these reports, but there was pretty much no information in them.
At times it was like, we have nothing to tell you, basically. It was like literally like, yeah, I got to file a report today and I got nothing to say. Yes.
So then, needless to say, the judge gets pretty mad. And so she says, I'm not taking this. And what I'm going to do is over the next 2 weeks, we're going to have discovery over exactly who's doing what or who's not doing what. And, in other words, I'm going to find out what's going on here. And the Trump administration doesn't like that. So then they appealed that to the Fourth Circuit and basically said that, she has no right to be doing this and it's an intrusion into foreign affairs. And so that's where we get the 7-page opinion from yesterday.
That's right. And it was a remarkable opinion that's definitely worth reading, and essentially one in which Judge Wilkinson, who is long been considered a conservative titan on the bench. I think it's fair to say when you and I were in law school, he was
one of the most conservative judges to go clerk for.
Yeah, all the Federalist Society folks wanted to clerk for him. He was one of the big. Him and Judge Ludig, ironically, right?
Yeah,
who would have thought? Judge Ludig, of course, who's testifying before the January 6th committee.
And now they're like, the woke left.
Yeah, right. It's insane. But yes, Judge Wilkinson has this opinion in which he basically says. He tries to, it almost seems to me like he's trying to convince / beg the executive branch that it's in their interest too to have the rule of law. And like, come on, guys, like, it's going to help everybody. And if you don't try to respect the rule of law, it's going to bring ruin to us all, essentially. Is that like I mean, it's very pithy, but is that kind of the bottom line of the Wilkinson decision?
I didn't see it as them begging. I saw it as kind of, here's how this will work out in a way where you will have some plausible ground to act the way that you have. And if you don't, I mean, there was that whole part about history is going to tell the real story.
Right. I mean, this is the passage that I'm referring to, Asha.
Okay.
Now the branches come too close to grinding irrevocably against one another in a conflict that promises to diminish both. This is a losing proposition all around. The judiciary will lose much from the constant intimations of its illegitimacy. to which by dint of custom and detachment we can only sparingly reply. The executive will lose much from a public perception of its lawlessness and all of its attendant contagions. The executive may succeed for a time in weakening the courts, but over time, history, as you refer to, will script the tragic gap between what was and all that might have been, and law in time will sign its epitaph. It's sort of like you'll be judged by history, so you should care about this. And of course, we all know that Donald Trump is so concerned about how history will regard his lawless actions that he's going to be shamed by the judge to do the right thing.
Maybe I have a different take on that.
Okay.
What if it's not to Trump but to the Supreme Court?
Yeah, I think that's right. I do.
Hey guys, everybody's been seeing how you've been enabling him and looking the other way, kind of, and soft pedaling this, and maybe it's sort of saying, grab a pair and do what you like, step up for this institution, and then let the chips fall where they may, but ultimately the arc of the moral universe will curve towards justice.
Sure. And I agree. I hear what you're saying. I mean, I do think for that reason that the Trump administration is not going to appeal this and have this opinion be what's before the Supreme Court. I think they'll muck around for a while and blow a lot more time shuffling their feet and doing nothing in the district court before she's forced to try to do something else. And they'll focus entirely on her power to do exactly what whatever it is that she tries to do.
Yeah. Well, I mean, their appeal was also, they were trying to mandamus her. They were looking for an order from the Fourth Circuit to tell her to just back off. And the other piece of that opinion is the court saying, yeah, we're not going to micromanage the court basically doing its job. And also was not having any of the separation of powers arguments that Trump was making, that she's intruding in the president's foreign affairs powers. And I think they said, this is pretty simple. This is the heart of liberty. This is habeas corpus, the ability for someone to get their foot in the door in front of a court before they're whisked off in a plane to a foreign gulag. And basically, if we don't have that, then the game is pretty much over in terms of our constitutional order.
Absolutely. The judge makes it very clear, right? If today the executive claims the right to deport without due process and in disregard of court orders, what assurance will there be tomorrow that it will not deport American citizens and then disclaim responsibility to bring them home? And what assurance shall there be that the executive will not train its broad discretionary powers upon its political enemies? So, of course, I mean, it's like you were joking that, Judge Ludig, Judge Wilkinson are the woke left here, but this is Judge Wilkinson setting out like broadly, here are the stakes. And so that's why I think, as you said up top, this really crystallizes the issue. And I do think, another episode that I referred to earlier, Senator Van Hollen's visit does as well. I mean, it's worth noting, Asha, the El Salvadorian government isn't doing this. In other words, isn't paying for this prison and paying for these people, including Mr. Abrego Garcia, to be housed there because it just wants to look good to the Trump administration or please them. They're getting paid $6 million. And that's taxpayer money of ours, by the way, they're going to pay for this program. And that alone is questionable. But it's interesting because, of course, the Salvadorian government is acting in many ways at the behest of the Trump administration. And of course, they have the means to facilitate his release. Just stop the payments. That will facilitate a lot of release.
Right. So the Trump administration has tried to muddy the waters in a couple of ways. So first is that all of a sudden they're saying, okay, but Abrego Garcia is a terrorist. And they're bringing back this 2019 document about the Chicago Bulls gear and the confidential informant, which was before he got the withholding of removal order. But they're trying to put this out there as sort of, I guess, he's a bad guy, he's a terrorist, and so we shouldn't bring him back, because if we brought him back, all we would do is just turn around and fly him back out. And that kind of tries to obscure the point, which is, yes, even if you do that, even if he is a terrorist, even if you suddenly have new information, or you think that putting this in front of a judge again is going to change it, you still have to go through the process of having the withholding removal lifted before you can remove him. Like, you actually have to go through those extra steps, because that's the point of due process. That's the process that you go through to do that. And the other piece that they're saying is, and we can't do anything anyway. Our authority stops at the border. After that, it's just all Bukele. We can't do anything. And in a lot of ways, Senator Van Hollen going and actually being able to talk to Abrego Garcia, they finally did give him access. And he was able to see him and speak to him, really undercuts that whole idea. And now I'm not really sure why Bukele did that. It seems like it kind of throws Trump under the bus, because it obviously makes his claims false. I have to wonder if Bukele has other concerns. El Salvador is a party to the International Criminal Court, by the way. And, he may be seeing like what happened to the former president of the Philippines, Duterte, who is now, being prosecuted by the ICC. I don't like, that's just one theory, but in other words, he doesn't have the strength of the United States to fall back on in some of these ways. And maybe he just doesn't want to thumb his nose at a U.S. senator. And maybe that still means something in other parts of the world.
Well, I alluded to this earlier. It's important to note that it wasn't like Senator Van Hollen arrived in El Salvador and they rolled out a red carpet for him. He was stopped at a military checkpoint and was not allowed to see Mr. Abrego Garcia. And there was a lot of people focused on that fact for, hours. It's like, what is going to happen? There was a big question. And why are Republicans able to see Mr. Abrego Garcia, but not Senator Van Hollen, and what's going on? And I think that the El Salvadorian government also perhaps is thinking ahead to the fact that, like, look, the Republicans may not be in control forever of the United States. And do we really want to see them like some sort of stooge government that's like a MAGA government? Maybe we want to actually be friendly to the United States and so on.
Yeah. So, I think there's a few different angles here. One thing is that the Trump administration is framing this as some sort of foreign affairs issue, and the reason they're framing it that way is to basically reduce the authority that the court can have over what Trump does, because foreign affairs traditionally gets a lot of deference, and it can also be shielded from court intrusion in terms of like executive privilege and state secrets privilege and stuff like that. But you mentioned before, Renato, that basically Bukele is a contractor of the U.S. government.
Right.
And one of the things that I've been thinking about is this is still a domestic policy solution. This is about an invasion, quote unquote, into the United States of illegal immigrants and what to do when you capture them. It's just that after, rounding them up, the place that they've chosen to hold them is in this other country. But I think this is very different than a foreign affairs issue. This isn't about our relationship with El Salvador. This isn't about, some trade agreement that Trump is negotiating. This is, in other words, if you were to put it on a spectrum of how much of this is domestic and how much of this is foreign, this is like 90% a domestic issue.
I mean, this strikes me, the analogy that I would use, Asha, is Guantanamo. Guantanamo is part of Cuba. It's leased to the United States. We have an arrangement, and so we're able to keep people there. But that's a U.S. government decision that it wants to bring people to Guantanamo. Just like here, the United States government, the executive branch, made a decision. We want to take this guy out of the United States and bring him to El Salvador. I don't think there's any question that they could get him back if they wanted to. And frankly, all those people would be released tomorrow if they said we're not paying any more money. I would assume. I don't think El Salvador is just going to keep those people imprisoned and pay for their for them to stay there without
Well,
getting paid by the U.S. government.
this is different than Guantanamo, actually, because what the court in Boumediene in 2008 said about Guantanamo is that actually the U.S. has sovereign control over Guantanamo Bay, over that prison. So the U.S. actually exercises jurisdiction
I see, as
over
dominion
that
over it.
prison. And that's actually what makes this really dark. Because in that case, the court said because the U.S. has control over this, that's why the constitutional right to habeas corpus reaches these people. So whoever designed this particular policy said, okay, if we really want to put this out of the reach of the courts, if we want to find a constitutional black hole, it has to be in another country under the control of that government. And that's why they are saying these people are under the sovereign control of El Salvador, not the US, because they are trying to draw a distinction with that case. But that's why I think the contractual arrangement is really important, because obviously this is a conditional, it's not that we've turned them over and there is some independent reason that El Salvador, like they've indicted them in El Salvadoran courts and are detaining them under some El Salvadoran authority. Do you see what I'm saying?
Right. They're doing it as an agent of the United States government.
Correct. In
That's how
property,
I
you would
view it.
say like a bailier and bailee, right?
Yeah, that's how I view this. And I hear you that it's true that technically speaking that there was a finding in Guantanamo that there wasn't here. It's just the way I view it is El Salvador is doing this as an agent of the United States government. There's no question in my mind that if the United States government wanted to, they could get all of these people back.
I'm just telling you the legal distinction that they are gonna
Rely
on. And what's extraordinary is that in Guantanamo, that was a wartime detention that was done under a congressional authorization for the use of military force. And military deference, I would argue, is even greater than foreign affairs deference. And even in that case, even when the government said, hey, we're fighting a war, we have to do this, you should not be asking any questions. By the way, these people have never set foot in the United States and they were captured in Afghanistan. Like they have nothing to do with the United States. Even there, the court said, no, they're entitled to due process. And so I would say in this situation where, at least with the MS-13, I mean, the Venezuelan nationals, they're using the Alien Enemy Act. The MS-13 quote unquote people, or people that they're accusing of being MS-13, that's not under the Alien Enemy Act. I think that they are just using the designation of MS-13 as a foreign terrorist organization, and then basically saying these people are terrorists and therefore removable. And so they're really not. I mean, I'm sure there is some immigration authority that they're acting on statutorily, but it's not the same kind of delegation of authority as even the Alien Enemy Act or some kind of other wartime delegation. My point here is I don't think that there should be that much deference under these facts and in this context.
No, I think that's right. I think that's almost like taking the assertions and arguments of the Trump administration more seriously than they deserve. But yes, I do think the Supreme Court will, and the Supreme Court's going to engage in this sort of, searching for, whether, how to draw lines, because in a hypothetical world where you had an executive that was acting in good faith, there might be reasons why their agreements with foreign governments shouldn't be second guessed by courts. I will say that there was a lot of talk during the campaign of Project 2025 and kind of an argument that the Trump administration will come up with has figured out clever ways to get around and find flaws in our constitutional system. And I think this is a good example of that. I mean, at times when we've talked in this podcast, just to kind of take a 10,000 foot view for here for a minute, Asha, there have been times over the last, because it hasn't even been 100 days yet of the Trump presidency, but over the last 80 something days of the Trump administration, where I'm like, they're trying to do X, and you can see what they're trying to do, but they're really going about it in a dumb way. This is not. And I think that's part of the point you were making a minute ago when you said, look, this is why they've chosen to do it this way rather than putting everyone in like Oklahoma or Utah or something.
Yeah. No, they're being a little bit savvier, I guess, than they are in other arenas. And it's clear that they have lawyers who have really looked at the legal precedents in the terrorism context and are looking for gray areas to exploit. And look, they're not the first administration to do this, right? The Bush administration used World War II precedents and looked for gray areas that they could exploit in the war on terror because, they're different. The kind of enemy that you're fighting is different. And similarly, terrorists are different than immigrants. And so they're trying to apply this whole framework. One thing that I think is important to point out, and I alluded to this earlier, is the whole idea of this being an intrusion into the executive branch's foreign affairs power. And it's not just the Trump administration's argument, Renato, because I think the Supreme Court opened the door to it. They have that language in the opinion that they issued. But that, I think, is a red herring because the real separation of powers issue here is that Trump is usurping judicial functions. If you're not bringing someone back to have a court order lifted or to have a court do what a court does, which is look at the facts and make determinations on your accusation to determine whether it is you've met your burden. And by the way, in this case, in the immigration context, the burden is pretty low. You have to show something by a preponderance of the evidence. So all the Trump administration would have to do if they really have crazy evidence that he's MS-13, that is to go back in front of a judge and show it. If you're not willing to do that, then what you are saying is that Trump is the fact finder, not an immigration judge, not a jury. Trump is the judge. He's the one who has, I guess, unilaterally lifted the withholding order. And Trump is the executioner. He's the one who's issued the sentence. He's issued a death sentence, basically, life sentence at the very least on all of these people. And I think that's the most troubling part is this is a usurpation of an entire branch of government. And I think it will be interesting to see if the Supreme Court understands this situation as exactly that.
I mean, I think they understand what's going on here. I mean, I almost think that there's like a willful blindness element to some of these decisions where you sort of pretend that, what's going on is not what's really going on here. Wilkinson, I think, lays it all bare. I mean, he actually cites articles like news articles about how Trump's talking about how homegrowns are next. In other words, how U.S. citizens who were born here in the United States could be deported by him. I mean, the way I look at it is just it's fundamentally a decision on their part that they don't want to have due process, which is a fundamental protection. And that's part of the Bill of Rights and also part of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. I think that's really what this is basically they're like, look, you don't deserve any kind of process whatsoever before we completely upend your life and imprison you forever.
Yeah, and that's a separation of powers issue. That's cutting the judiciary out.
Yeah, well, and I think, but that's part of the reason why I saw almost begging element to Judge Wilkinson's opinion, because the executive could do whatever the hell it wants. And it's not like the judiciary is like, oh, here's consequences. He's basically like, this is going to be really bad. And it lays stark in many ways to me in the limits that we've all known about. We've talked about this for years, I feel like now, Asha, on what the judiciary could do if the executive branch refuses to enforce their orders. And ultimately, that's if the Trump administration is willing to do that, and we're essentially in President Jackson land, where basically we're not going to care what the Supreme Court says or the courts say, then we don't have the rule of law anymore.
Well, one thing I'll say about that is I think that if Trump defies a court order, he by definition is not acting under official authority. And
Yeah,
I don't think that these would be official acts.
yeah, it's interesting. Perhaps,
I mean,
I
if the
mean,
Supreme Court says, actually, you don't have the authority to put people on planes and send them there without due process, and then he puts them on planes and sends them there without due process, that cannot possibly be an official act. That is an extra constitutional act. It is outside the scope of Article 2. And I know people are very jaded and cynical about accountability, but I'm just pointing out that even under this huge swath of immunity that the Supreme Court has granted, there are things that are outside of it. I think this would be one of them, and it would expose Trump and it would expose everyone under him who follows these effectively illegal orders to criminal liability.
yeah, until he pardons them.
Stop!
But
Stop being Debbie Downer.
but in all seriousness, look, Trump is already in his late 70s and intends to continue running for office, as we've also heard from him a lot recently. Right? He's not done with the presidency. Um, Look, there is a reason why we started with the question that we did at the beginning of this episode. We've been talking about for years about how the rule of law is being chipped away. Obviously, the immunity decision is part of that, and there's a lot of things that you can point to. But this is just so core and so basic to the functioning of the judiciary and to our constitutional order that you have conservative judges writing opinions about it. It's very notable. We don't have an answer today to how this is going to turn out, but Magic 8 Ball says it's not looking very good right now.
It's not looking good, and I think we do need to remember that ultimately the final aspect of the rule of law is that when someone is not observing the rule of law, when the president is not observing the rule of law, we have impeachment. And that's so, we're kind of looking at this as the president and the judiciary, but we can't forget that the reason that we're in this face-off is because Congress has completely abdicated its role.
No doubt about it. And well, let's hope we get to free and fair elections in 2026. So, Asha, we are recording this on Friday, April 18th, but there is an insane amount of chatter and discussion regarding executive orders that the Trump administration is intending to release, if not today, in the upcoming week. So by the time you look at this podcast, view this podcast, listen to this podcast, this will likely have already happened and be a thing. And essentially, the executive orders allegedly are going to state that, for example, on Earth Day, that environmental organizations are not tax exempt organizations for purposes of 501c3 status, that they will suddenly lose that. There's also talk about him declaring that immigration organizations and nonprofits are terrorist organizations, or are aiding and abetting kind of terrorist organizations. Very, very concerning. And behind the scenes, the reason that I first became alerted to this is nonprofits have been calling me about it, and I have been talking to others, and there's all sorts of calls and planning, and lawyers are mobilized because this looks like, now that Trump has gone after law firms, this is the next group to go after.
Yeah, I think let's zoom out and look at kind of the big picture strategy here. This is about knocking out or destabilizing or eliminating institutions one by one. And sometimes we think of institutions as being government institutions, like the Justice Department or something like that. But in a democratic society, you have a lot of institutions. You have the press, you have the legal profession, you have scientists, you have universities, and one of them is also nonprofits. And I think we need to understand what's happening as a systematic kind of targeting of institutions one by one, because all of them present a threat to an authoritarian form of government. They're going to go after the states also pretty soon, I think, very systematically.
I think this is another example of the Trump administration acting in a devious or savvy way, depending on whatever word. I was going to say savvy, but I think that makes it sound like this is not a negative thing, which it obviously is. Devious.
Malevolently savvy.
There you go. And the reason I'm contrasting it is I think it's fair to say, Asha, that some of the like Doge goofy stuff that was happening in week 1 or 2 or 3 of the administration, we were talking about like, wow, trying to lay off, large swaths of federal workers in this way. It doesn't make any sense, right? Or whatever. It's not the savvy way of doing things. I think that they are going after groups that they know are vulnerable to executive action. Law firms is a great example. Law firms, we talked about in a prior episode why they're vulnerable. Now you're looking at nonprofit organizations. Those nonprofit organizations, whether it's the League of Conservation Voters or Sierra Club or Greenpeace or whoever, they are reliant on that 501c3 status. And if that is revoked, they have to be concerned. Like, will this impact their bank accounts? Will they be able to make payroll? What do they do with the money that they have? Do they have to return all their donations now? What do they, how do they solve this problem? He has a way of just through an executive order that, can be typed up in a span of minutes, can totally turn these organizations upside down and force them to incur massive costs and massive disruption to their operations.
Yeah. And I think there's an even more devious path for the nonprofits that help immigrants and refugees and asylees. So in our first block, we talked about how the Trump organization has designated MS-13 and Tren de Aragua as foreign terrorist organizations. Now, Congress gives the State Department the authority to designate organizations as foreign terrorist organizations. And there's certain criteria, but there's a huge amount of deference that's given to the State Department to make that determination. And so, one example, and there can be organizations that previously were considered political organizations that have First Amendment rights who can be designated as foreign terrorist organizations. And obviously that makes them lose a lot of rights and stuff that they have. So for example, when the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Ilam, LTTE, used to be kind of a political organization, the State Department designated as an FTO. They challenged it and said, this is an infringement on our First Amendment rights. And basically that did not go anywhere because it's totally up to the State Department to determine when they've crossed the threshold into being a terrorist organization. The reason this is important is that once an organization is designated as an FTO, anyone who is providing them with any kind of assistance can be accused of providing material support to terrorism. And that's a crime. So you can imagine, especially if they're muddying the waters between like who, like, let's say there was a group that helps asylees, with their applications that helped kill Abrego Garcia. And then the Trump administration says, hey, you are providing material support for terrorism because you were basically helping him fill out his asylum paperwork. And yeah, go ahead, Renato.
No, it's crazy. I mean, it cuts to the core of another one of our core freedoms. I mean, when you think about what are the things that make sure that we have a constitutional system of government that respects our rights and allows us to be free. Due process is like a big one. That was our first segment. We're talking about due process, a core thing. The government can't just throw you in prison and lock away the key without giving you a hearing and an opportunity to be heard and so on. Here, this is to me core rights to speak and organize. Law firms are part of that too. I'm not saying they weren't, but this is to me more core. Okay. Yes. I mean, law firms, are people banding together, and yes, they do say things and so forth, but they're business organizations of realistically. Whereas like the League of Conservation Voters, that's literally an organization of people who come together because they have a particular viewpoint, not even a partisan viewpoint, a viewpoint that they like clean air or something, and they like clean water and things like that. And basically you're like, you know what? I am declaring that to be, not educational or not charitable or whatever. And when the terrorism context, it's of course even more dangerous because you can imagine a determination that, who knows, whatever organization you want, whether it's indivisible, or it's, the immigration rights organization or whatever, basically saying you are all terrorist organizations. And so therefore, anybody who donates to those organizations or puts time into those organizations, are themselves
Providing material support.
liability. Or he could say that or the executive order could be MS-13 is the terrorist organization, and I'm making a finding as the president of the United States. I'm ordering the DOJ to investigate all of these other organizations as providing material support to MS-13. And now
That's what I think. That's how I think it's going to go.
Okay.
Which then also, I think, would dry up the money for people who donate to those organizations, but then puts the people who actually work at those organizations in criminal crosshairs. And of course, Stephen Miller would love that, right?
Of course. And
this people in jail who help the asylees and refugees and things like that. I mean, imagine like that is like his fantasy.
It's beyond that. I mean, this is turning people's lives upside down. I mean, being the subject of a criminal investigation turns your life upside down, creates enormous stress, enormous costs. It swallows up everything else in your life. Tremendous resource drain. And essentially what Trump is doing is he's taking away organizations that can potentially help people who are being targeted. So we talked in the first segment about Mr. Abrego Garcia. Then any organization that might be providing those lawyers to him that we talked about, you mentioned his lawyers in the last segment, they're all going to be so busy fending off criminal investigations that they're going to be too busy to help the next person or the next person.
Yeah. And on the terrorism front, in terms of designating a group as a foreign terrorist organization and then being able to go after organizations that provide assistance to them criminally, there is already a Supreme Court precedent on the books that upholds this. It's an Obama era case, actually, and it's a legal aid organization that was providing assistance to the LTTE, which I just mentioned, and then another group, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, KWP, which the State Department had designated both by that point as foreign terrorist organizations. And Humanitarian Law Project basically assisted them on humanitarian efforts and, peaceful ways to achieve certain objectives to whatever, help the population. So they said, we're not providing support for their terrorist activities. And basically the court says it doesn't matter. It's okay for Congress to have had a very broad span, a broad definition of what constitutes material support. And it can include advice and it can include assistance, in the case of immigrants, like even something, if they were to go down this route, lawyers or organizations, as I mentioned before, even assisting them in filling out paperwork and to, get relocated or things like that would probably fall in the material support category. And so I think there's two things going on, Renato, which is one, to make it harder for these people, the kind of downstream people to get any assistance. But I think overall, all of these things, if you think about it, are really about associational activity. And I think it's important to understand that for authoritarian regimes, for tyrants, people banding together and doing anything with some common purpose is incredibly threatening. because that provides a point for resistance. The goal of the tyrant is to isolate people, to make them disconnected and unable to find points of shared values or goals or anything like that. So, do I think that they're thinking that deeply? Maybe not, but I think intuitively that is what they are ultimately trying to do, is just to fragment society in such a way that people can't band together to work towards a common purpose.
Yeah, they're figuring out, and it's very asymmetrical because they're basically figuring out ways to, with very little cost or effort on their part, impose enormous burdens on the other. And that asymmetry, I think, is very important.
Yeah.
When we were looking at and just to draw some comparison here, when you and I were looking at the actions of the Trump administration in week 1, 2, 3, 4, there's a lot of times in which they're trying to get something done, with whether it's the Treasury Department or the FBI or whatever, and they're going through enormous hurdles and trying to jump through all these hoops just to get rid of some group of workers. And now here you have literally just some sort of copy paste executive order that gets put on the website, and suddenly it causes enormous upheaval, enormous costs, and can really dissuade speech and can dissuade organization. And that's why I say these are so core, because we're talking about due process. Here we're talking about speech, the ability to organize, etc. These are what makes our country free. So this is the sort of thing that it's not an exaggeration to say goes to the heart of our constitutional system and what makes us a democracy and our democratic republic. And I think that's why we're previewing this issue, even though it hasn't happened yet, because this can be huge. I mean, to me, in many ways, this is far worse than what was happening with the law firms.
I don't know that I think it's all bad.
Yeah, it's like trying to compare evils that have done throughout history, but I think this is, to me, very, very deeply concerning. I view this as a ratcheting up, and I think I just can't imagine what group he's going to target next. So, Asha, before we go on, we've had such an unhappy note throughout this entire episode. I'm ready for more unhappiness. What's going on with you?
I lost my phone 2 days ago.
That may be the greatest tragedy. We've talked about people being in prison for their life. We've been talking about people who devote their lives to nonprofit work being criminally targeted, and you lost your phone. That's right up there as far as I'm concerned.
So fair enough. And I have tried to remind myself of that when I start feeling like a victim, is that this is a first world problem. And I acknowledge that. So I do not mean to imply that my losing my phone is as bad as being imprisoned in CCOT.
I'm just teasing, but yes.
No, but it's true. Like, I mean, as bad things go, it's like not that bad. And, we survived for decades, you and I, without a phone. I mean, probably until I was 35. I didn't have a smartphone. So life can go on. But I will say it's just really hard. You don't realize how many things you need to do, like you need your phone for. And also when you try to use the alternative, like, your laptop or desktop to get into, like, I wanted to call an Uber yesterday. So I tried to get on Uber on my laptop, but because I never used it on my laptop, it's like, well, we've sent you a code to your phone ending in blah, blah, blah. And I was like, I don't have my phone.
Oh my God.
It doesn't even offer you the option to send it to your email.
So one thing that has been like a game changer for me is, so I always use an iPad Pro. I think we talked about that at some episode or another.
Yeah.
And I got the version that has the like wireless on it. So it's basically like another device on my plan versus having a Wi-Fi only version. And it's a game changer, because if you don't have your phone, or if it's out of juice, you have all your apps. It's part of the same environment.
So I have an iPad Pro.
Okay.
What do I do to do that?
Well, maybe download the Uber or Lyft app or whatever you're using and get that set up just like you
Okay.
would in your phone. Like get all your apps set up there. And then this way you get two devices where you can do the exact same thing. It's like having a backup phone.
Okay. What if I have a backup phone? I mean, like, what if I found my son's old phone, I wiped it, and I downloaded everything from the cloud, but I mean, it doesn't have a SIM card, so it doesn't have my phone number on it. But can
So
I still use
Asha,
it?
can't you just afford to go to like the store and get a new phone? I
No,
mean,
so it's not. This is the problem. So this is actually a work issued phone.
oh,
So they
that
have
is a
to. So
that's the problem.
that's the problem. And this happened right before the long weekend. So they're like, "Yeah, we'll get to this next week." And then I fly to the UK on Monday night.
What? Wow,
Yes,
these are first world problems you've
I
got,
know these are
Asha.
first world problems. Okay, everybody, I totally understand this, but I'm just saying that
My employer gives me a free phone. I've made a decision to just use their phone, not have my own phone. And I've lost my phone, and I'm going to be going on a very fabulous overseas trip.
but I
You know, they
can't call
do
an Uber.
sell. Yeah, I can't call an Uber. Don't they sell phones in the UK? I mean, can't you just buy one there?
I know. I feel like this is actually divine intervention.
Yes, I
Because
think
it's
that's
going to
right.
force me to get some kind of burner phone or temporary phone just to use
Mm.
for the trip, which
You s-
means that when I come back in, and if I get
oh,
stopped and sent to secondary, and they're like,
okay.
"Show us your phone," I can be like, "Okay, here."
You don't be a Bulls fan. That's all.
I will
My own.
don't wear
No, our team is not very good, so just
don't wear a
yeah.
Bulls hoodie
No,
coming
no
back into the
Bulls.
country.
No, you can be a Knicks fan, but not a Bulls fan, apparently.